Okay, so now we start with this new topic called literature reviews. And what's going to happen in this session is that I'm going to have a presentation on literature reviews. And then we'll have two more hands-on presentations by Dina, one on article search and one on the referencing program. And then we're going to do the self-work exercise. So what is a literature review? A literature review is a summary of previous research on a specific topic. And what do I mean when I say literature review, and what am I going to talk about today? Three different things. One is the review of the literature that you do on for your background and introduction sections on any protocol, research proposal for grant application, or in the research article. The other thing is the literature review articles. And then there's also systematic literature reviews with or without meta-analysis. So we'll talk about all three. So we start with a review of the literature. Why should you review the literature? First of all, you have no choice. You have to review the literature because as I said, every proposal, every article, you need the background section or the introduction section. And in that, you have to put your research into context, and you have to, identify the studies that were done and show what has been done on this field. In doing the literature review, you will learn a lot about the topic, you will become experts, and you will not only find out what is known, but also what is unknown, the knowledge gaps. Okay, which research was done, but what information is still missing? What information is missing, and you're going to save the world and find out. So as I mentioned before, when you do a literature review, you find information for your background and introduction, and it all leads to you strengthening your rationale. So you say what has been done, what is missing, why is my study so important, and finally you reach your own research question. But it's also good for the discussion, and in the background and introduction there's a different function for the literature review than there is in the discussion. As I said, in the background and introduction, it's all leading to your research question. In the discussion, you're going to put your results into context with other findings from other studies. And then you're going to discuss, why are my results similar or different? And you discuss the similarities and differences.
So in the background, we use the literature to justify why we're doing the research, and in the discussion, we analyze our results in comparison or in what goes on in other papers.
Yes.
Put it in the context of other stuff that's going on.
Yeah. And you discuss why. That's the most interesting thing, is why are there differences? Why are there similarities? But it's not only the results that you can look at with other studies, you can also look at the methodology, and you can learn from previous successes and failures when you design your study, which tools should be used, what kind of selection should be used. Usually in papers in the discussion part, if it's a good article, they'll also tell you what were the pitfalls and what were the advantages and disadvantages of their study. And there you can learn a lot.
And sometimes there's a letter of the editor,
right,
to the editor or others people analyzing the other papers.
Yeah.
It's also
But good researchers should be critical to themselves and say, we got these results, but maybe they're a little bit biased because we use this population and not that, or because we use this tool and not that tool, or we had a different cutoff, whatever. And then you try to design your study also in ways that would enable comparison and combination of the finding with the previous study. So if you're doing a lab work and you define anemic at a certain cutoff, which is not what other people have been doing, then it's hard to compare your study to other studies if they don't have the raw data. And if you have a study that's comparable, then you might be lucky enough to be included in a systematic review or a meta-analysis later on. So it's important to contribute to the body of evidence. But of course, you don't always have to follow things that people did. If there are pitfalls in that one and you want to, for example, you can do a study on validating a new tool. So it all depends on the.
But you're saying that it's a good idea to see what most
Others
papers,
have
because
done.
then you can be a part of.
Exactly, yeah. Unless your question is, unless you have a problem with this tool and you want to prove that another tool is better, then you don't do that.
Or for
But
some
usually-
reasons, I need another cutoff in my population.
Yeah, but then you explain why. I mean, if it has a reason behind it, it's fine. But if not, then try to do the same way that others have done so that you can compare your results to others. And avoid research wastage. Don't do a Me Too study. You know, they checked the complications. I want to do it too. Chovav, we'll talk about it later, that you actually explained what you will add to the body of knowledge.
But sometimes the populations are different.
Exactly.
So I'm
So that's a
doing
good
it,
reason.
I'm doing it too because I have a
Exactly.
different population, I
Exactly.
have a different.
So if there's a rationale, if there's a reason to do it, the same
Like
study,
if
but
they
in a
did
different.
something in Korea, there's no reason to do it.
Exactly. But if they did it in the US, it's a different situation than in Israel, right?
Or Tel Aviv, Ichilov.
So if there's a reason for doing the same kind of study again, like because your population is different and special, then it's fine. But don't do it just to do another one of those studies. You need something special. You need to add something. And what kind of references do you use? So usually we use peer-reviewed articles. These can be original research articles, which are also called empirical or primary sources. They're called primary because you do primary analysis on the data that you yourself collected, okay? Now with the review articles and the systematic reviews, it's called secondary analysis because what they analyze is studies that have already been done. So their raw material is articles, not.
They're considered strong.
Systematic reviews are considered very strong, especially with meta-analysis. We'll discuss it later. Then there's also conference proceedings and books. And then there's the gray literature. So the literature I mentioned here is peer-reviewed. It means that it has some kind of, what do you call it?
A review process.
Experts
Yeah.
from the subject.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And gray literature are those who are not peer-reviewed. So they're reports, theses, lectures, blogs, or articles in popular media. So they don't go through the review process.
לא הבנתי מה זה peer reviewed, סליחה.
Peer-reviewed, when you submit an article to a journal, it goes to two or more, maybe 3 reviewers that they have to read your article and see if it's well planned, if your results make sense, if your analysis makes sense, if it's good quality. They check the quality of your paper, and then they make comments. What did you want to say?
It's interesting. It could be a very good study, but if it doesn't add anything to the literature, generally gets rejected.
Reviewers do that.
Yeah.
So anyways, what they look at is if it's really a good
But sometimes
study.
that's
I mean,
what
if
they
it's
say.
not,
They say it's a great article, but nothing new.
but nothing new. Okay, so you see why you have to have a rationale. So these are not peer-reviewed, but sometimes they have very important information, and also for the background, like if you want to talk specifically about, malaria control in Zanzibar, for example, you'll find it only.
Why did you
Yeah,
do that?
You'll find it only in the Ministry of Health reports. You won't find it anywhere else. So sometimes you have to use gray literature, and it's good to use. You usually want to restrict your search to the past, I don't know how many years. It really depends on how much information there is out there on your topic. As we said with your study, you don't want very old data because maybe things have changed, maybe the technique has changed. So you have to restrict it. I think Dina told me yesterday that in nursing, they restrict them from taking 5 years.
Yes.
They
That's
can't
long.
take articles that are more than 5 years old. But it really depends on the topic.
But sometimes
Maybe there's.
you
a
want to
good-
do 5 years ago because the regimen changed and you want to see.
Yeah,
The
so
before
it
and after.
really
You might
depends.
have
It
Russian
depends
outbreak.
on your, yeah, it depends on what you want
Russian
to
is
do,
depression.
but
No, depression. That's
So-
the.
but maybe articles that were
the
written,
snakes
maybe articles
venom,
that
the
were,
anti-snakes venom changed 5 years
okay,
ago. So
maybe
you wanna
the,
know what-
yeah, so maybe the art, maybe if you want to use a certain technique, a certain tool, maybe it's changed, so the ones before that wouldn't be relevant because they didn't use the same tool as we did, or whatever.
Okay.
In any case, more recent and updated articles are important to cite. Even if you have one, you know, איך אומרים, מיתולוגי, המאמר המיתולוגי שכולם, that everyone cites, you know. If you're stuck, you can find a good review article or even an original article. Look at the references, which references did they use, and find more references. Or you can find out who referenced a certain article that you're using. So it can go
How can
back
you do that?
and forward. So
Technically?
Dina is going to show you.
That's
yeah.
a neat trick.
So now we're going to talk about structuring your introduction. So it has a funnel structure. It goes from broad and wide to your specific question. So you start with a broad statement to set the context. Then you state what is known. Then you identify the problems, what the gaps are, the knowledge gaps, how your study will address this problem, and then you state your research question. So I have some examples for each one of those steps. In setting the context, one Dr. Abu Jamal and Professor Edelstein, I think they were from, they wrote an article about, was it antibodies? Antibodies after vaccination of COVID vaccinations. But even though the article was very specific, they started in a very broad statement, like the COVID pandemic, which started in 2019 in China, continues to spread despite multiple lockdowns and prolonged control measures implemented in most countries. It's a very broad statement, and then they go down and they make it more specific. And here also, they start with a very global statement, and then they go on to say, in Israel, this and this and this was done, okay? So you narrow it down. Another study that I'm going to give you more examples of later on is a systematic review that I was part of. It was about LTBI regimens, latent TB infection regimens, medications. And we started off also in a very broad, tuberculosis is a global priority infectious disease with an estimated 1.4 million deaths in 2015. So that's like the first. Then we narrow it down to LTBI.
A lot of
and
times
to
they write
regimens.
about costs, about the impact it has on the population.
It depends on it also depends on your, what?
Depends on the topic. Sometimes you want to focus on mortality and morbidity.
Right.
Someone you want to focus on economic impact. You know, often, for example, if you write about, if you're doing a study on a disease that, you know, it is not, I don't know, like acute gastrointestinal illness in children. It doesn't kill many kids, but it
costs a lot of money.
It costs a lot of money because
To hospitalize them.
missing schools, the
Right.
parents can't go to work because they have to look after the kids. Really depends on what the disease and what the objective.
That would be in the Western world. In the third world, it kills them.
Of course,
I mean, that's the context.
absolutely.
Low income countries and high income countries. So anyhow, what is known? So the wording, the kind of sentences you will see on the topic of what is known is a series of recent studies has indicated that running therapy, blah, blah, blah. Previous studies have shown this and that. Prior research suggests, And then here we have some nice examples. For example, Asna et al. Showed that what? A certain gene is associated with the side effects, maybe? And Handler et al. Demonstrated that
מי זה מי זה מורני? I'm trying to think, do I know?
yeah, Morani is the one who's not here today, he's the left.
Well, I didn't do anything with him. 2020.
Sorry, I forgot to remove your name here. I decided that Abu Ahmed and Morani are more. So anyhow, this is what is known. Then we go to the problem, the limitation. A number of questions remain to be addressed. A closer look at the literature on this, however, is lacking, blah, blah, blah. Previous study have almost exclusively focused on this, but not on what I want. I have an example from Chovav's proposal. Most previous studies reported on various clinical data, but did not examine the technical aspects of stoma creation and failures. Okay, so then he goes on to say, how his study is going to fix it. We intend to primarily focus on these aspects in the current study. Okay, so more work is necessary to understand. Additional studies are needed. This study will address further questions. And then you state your research question. So you come to the research question. In this study, we aim to check the technical aspects of stoma failure, blah, blah, blah. Okay? In this article, we present something new. All right, so that was that. And then some tips on how to write your review. From the articles you've chosen, just make a few notes on a few key points that are relevant to your research. Don't use everything they've said, only the things you really need. And keep them brief and write them in your own words. You have to beware of plagiarism. You can't use the words they have used unless you quote. If you use a quoting science, then it's fine. But you usually don't want to use a lot of quoting science. You want to use your own words to say what other people have found or didn't find. Now we're moving to the second part, which is talking about literature review articles. Okay, so up to now, it's more relevant for you because you're going to have to write these background sections. But if you want, you can also write a literature review article. If you have time, a lot of extra time on your hands.
I don't think that's less time than doing actual research.
But this is a literature review. So it's a comprehensive summary of previous research on a topic. So if before we were talking about not being objective, but being very, very much focusing on like, what do you call it? A slam dunk assist for your research. Here you have to be sort of objective and show all the research that is done on a certain topic. Okay, so you usually have an introduction that explains the purpose and the layout of the review. Then you have the body where you present the existing research, you analyze it, you evaluate it, and you synthesize the results. And then you have a conclusion, a wrap up, and you give conclusions on the topic. The problem is that sometimes authors may provide more of an opinion than an objective assessment. And they might not identify all relevant studies because they didn't do a good enough search, or because they selectively chose to include the ones that
prove their point.
That prove their point, that confirms their views. So because of this problem, we have the systematic literature reviews, okay? So the systematic literature reviews seek to systematically search for, appraise, and synthesize research evidence, adhering to strict guidelines and protocols. So it's not like they can dismiss one reference just because they don't like it. They have set rules and protocols.
They set
on
it
how-
up before
before
they
they
do
start.
the literature
Of course,
search.
of course. So they have a specific research question, they use a predefined explicit methodology, and they take steps to minimize the bias, for example, by having 2 reviewers do the work. And eligibility and appraisal is identified and assessed. And the purpose is to create an evidence base in order to help policymakers make well-informed decisions. It's called evidence-based medicine. I'm going to follow this example of this article that I told you about before with the latent TB infection. In this systematic review, which was also meta-analysis, we had the purpose of evaluating the efficacy and adverse events, the harms of LTBI treatment regimens. We very clearly stated which data sources we were going to use. We were going to use PubMed, Embase, Web of Science until a certain date, and then also look in the clinical trial registries and conference abstracts. And then we had also very specific protocols for how we were going to do the study selection and the data extraction. So for the study selection, we had inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, which articles we're going to include and which we're going to exclude. For example, in the inclusion, oh, you can't see. For example, in the inclusion criteria, we chose to use only randomized controlled trials, not observational and not trials that were not randomly randomized. In the exclusion criteria, for example, we didn't include articles that didn't have sufficient information on at least one of our main outcomes or endpoints, which was one was for the adverse events, the hepatotoxicity, or for the efficacy, development of active TB. And in the process, as I said, 2 reviewers independently performed title and abstract review, and then full article review. And we resolved the discrepancies through consensus. And if we couldn't reach consensus, we had to get another reviewer to decide. So
This
it's
is what-
very strict.
This is what done generally, or just this is an example?
No, this is the
What's
normal
done?
practice. Yeah,
Okay.
this is so I just want to show you that we started off with more than 3,000 articles, and in the end, we used only 61.
Mhm.
Why? First, there was deduplication.
Oh my God.
It's a
So
lot of
you
work.
read
Never
3,000
do it.
abstracts?
3,000
Yes.
titles.
Titles and if needed abstracts as well.
Type, okay.
We did deduplication, then we reviewed the title and abstract, and we excluded some of them because we found out that they were animal studies or that they weren't primary articles, they were reviews. It wasn't active TB, it was active TB and not latent TB, all kinds of reasons.
Can't you have artificial intelligence
Then-
help you with that? Like excluding
You
stuff?
will.
You will, but we're not there yet. You always need a human,
You're
right?
going through.
So then we went through 113 articles, and we also excluded on some of the same reasons, and we ended up with 61 of them.
Just to be clear, no one is asking you to do this, right?
No.
No, because I thought it's gonna be easier to do because all the problems we have, recruiting patients, getting the tissue.
Yeah.
It seems easier to do
But it's
a
a lot of
literature
work.
review, but apparently it's not.
Systematic reviews are a lot of work.
A lot of
but
work.
The thing, as Nita is saying, sorry, maybe I shouldn't talk with your lecture, but when you publish a systematic review, you have to show to the reviewers that you've gone through all these steps and that you've done it very systematically, otherwise you get rejected. And that means that as a reader, you can have confidence when you read a systematic review or meta-analysis, to some extent, that it shows you a relatively objective picture of the evidence, much more than one article, because you'll see that if you're looking at a single paper, an observational study or even a randomized controlled trial, you have issues with reproducibility, you have issues with study
Sample
design and sample size. And this is why you will see in the next thing in meta-analysis that some people looking at the same question end up with very different answers. So this is bringing it all together and kind of creating a kind of mega sample from all the little studies inside it. So that's why it's such a high level of evidence.
And so not all systematic reviews include meta-analysis. This one did. Meta-analysis is the use of statistical methods to summarize the results of the study included in the systematic review. Now, why don't all systematic reviews have meta-analysis? Well, sometimes there can be systematic review on qualitative data, then that's impossible. Sometimes the studies are too different to compare, to put together. So, but in this case, we had a meta-analysis.
Are you going to go into that? Because that's interesting. I always when I read these
A little
studies,
bit, yeah.
they comment on the variability and whatever. The different
Yeah. So a bit, and then you can ask more. So we have the data extraction. Again, two reviewers independently performed data extraction to a standardized template, an Excel sheet. And we checked and we extracted the information we needed, and also we assessed the study quality. So these are examples from the Excel sheet. I couldn't have it all in one, so but this is about the article. The participants were different. Some were HIV positive, some were immunosuppressed, some were not, some were, had renal failure. How was LTBI measured? Age category, gender ratio, the country, and in that country is the prevalence high or low of TB, high or low. Then we had the drugs. So we had the dose, the length of the dosage of the regimen. We had if they developed TB or not, if they developed the adverse events or not. If adherence was assessed, adherence of taking the drugs, how long was the follow-up, toxicity, and then we also had the appraisal, which I'm not going to talk about today because you get it in the next week. You'll be talking a lot with Jumana about appraisal of articles, but we checked to check how good and how, So selection bias, we checked performance bias, detection bias, reporting bias, all these biases to see what the quality of the research is. And here you can see some examples. As you can see, there's different drugs compared, sometimes no treatment to INH, placebo to INH. Now, why is it ethical to use placebo and no treatment in the study? I'm asking. Why is it ethical? Because it's latent, they're not sick, right? Thank you. And other treatments. So we compared different treatments depending on what they did in this certain article. Participant number changed a lot. Here it was more than 2,000. Here it was 100 and something patients. And sometimes we had variables. We had the outcome of hepatotoxicity, and sometimes we didn't. And also in development of active TB, that was in all of them. And then also the study quality. So as I said, selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, attribution bias, and reporting bias. So, so we compared it using meta-analysis approaches. This is what it looks like, the comparisons between placebo and this regimen and those. So we had a lot of comparisons. And in the end, we come to the forest plots.
Who does that?
The statistician.
Okay.
Well, actually,
Someone called a statistician.
I wanted to.
It's a program, right?
There's most statistical packages have a function.
Okay. And then we come to a forest plot and to our conclusion. that we found evidence that these 3 treatments were had high efficacy and were safe to use. So, but it's a lot of work.
Do you all understand how to interpret this? What this
is the
what this means?
odds ratios.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, when you look at this, basically each line is a different study, and the line in the middle means there's no effect. The one, you can see the odds ratio, the risk ratio. Everything on the left shows no, like that it's
effective.
or effective, yeah, and
It
then on
depends
the
on
right,
the
not
group
effective.
of
Depends what you're looking
This
at.
is
It could
the
be
protective
worse
effect,
or-
and this is the.
and then
So here you have like this treatment regimen compared with all of these. Here you have INH 6 months compared with all of these.
Okay.
So you see no treatments compared to others, then they're all like on this side because
So
we
no
all.
treatment doesn't
Ah,
have
yeah.
a line because that's
It's
the one
the
you're
baseline.
comparing to, it's the
the
baseline.
baseline.
Yeah, it's always, these are the baselines for
Okay.
these are the baselines for these, you see?
Okay. Yeah.
And then the baseline, no treatment has all of these comparisons, and the baseline placebo has these comparisons.
So you can see, for example, all the ones versus no treatment, that the treatments are effective, right?
Yeah.
Because they're on the right side, so there's less, whatever the outcome is here, it's
It's very interesting to look at the.
and then the bars, the horizontal bars are the confidence intervals, so it tells you how precise the results
Yeah, because
are.
it's very.
Some
it's
are very
long.
big
So a small
because
study
they're
will have a
small,
lot of
small
uncertainty.
sample size.
And you do it average or?
It's very
or
interesting
median?
to see that
It depends on the study.
the placebo and the no treatment do not exactly mirror each other.
And then what the software does, it puts all the studies together and gives you a summary whether overall it works and overall it doesn't work. And you can see it's interesting, for example, like with the no treatment, you could see that although all the studies are on the left, some of them have the
Very,
confidence
yeah.
intervals overlapping one, which means
How
that
do you
It's
regard
not
that? 'Cause
statistically
what I remember from
significant.
medical school is that that's considered insignificant.
Right.
If you have the confidence interval.
it could
Yeah.
be insignificant, it could be insignificant. This is why this is important. Is it not significant because there is no effect, or is it not significant because the study is too small to
Small
detect the
sample
difference?
size, yeah.
So but this is the beauty
don't
of
know.
this,
But that's the point.
you don't know.
You don't know.
From one study, you can't know, but when you do this and you add all the sample size, it will give you a real, a more accurate answer. This is why these.
But
these
you don't
studies
have
are
the bottom line here, right? You only have the different
You don't have the bottom.
Yeah, it presents the different studies. I just wanted to say a few words about the Cochrane Library. It's a collection of databases that contain different types of high quality evidence base to inform healthcare. And in there is also the database for systematic reviews. Those systematic reviews are all done by the Cochrane review groups, and they use the guidelines. Here you have a handbook for systematic reviews of interventions, and here of the diagnostic tests. And if you ever want to do a systematic review, maybe you should look at these guidelines. But don't. So here we have the quality of evidence. On the bottom is background information, expert opinion, and non-evidence-based guidelines. Then we have our observational studies, where the best one is the cohort studies. We have the experimental studies, where the best are the randomized controlled trials. And then we have the critical appraisal, where we have the systematic reviews and the meta-analysis on the top. So that's considered like the best evidence there is.
Can you please go back?
Yes. These are evidence-based
The
guidelines.
randomized controlled trials are much lower than the meta-analysis.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course, because it's only one study with a very limited number of.
Also, the ones is sub-classified to good and not good.
Yeah, but this is a
You know,
qualitative
randomized?
chart, obviously, a meta-analysis.
But these are all, but look, but these are all
studies you
original,
regard differently than you would.
but these are all
good and
research
good
articles. These are not research, these are secondary analysis, right?
כאילו, מה שנאמר זה outcome research, כאילו שזה בעצם משקף את התרופה, את היעילות שלה בחיים האמיתיים יותר מאשר ה-randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, because you use a lot more randomized control trials in the
כן.
meta-analysis. Okay, so these were the sources I used. We have a good friend Ziad that I studied with, and he gave me some PowerPoint presentations, and then we have, but you can go into these and look at them and use them. After Dina's explanation of how to do this, we will search and find one relevant article, summarize it into 2-3 sentences, and also you should compare like an outline of your background or introduction section. So what do you want to put in there? What kind of information do you need to prove that, to come to the conclusion that your study is important? And then throughout the week, you can continue writing your background section. And please bring the article you find, or if you want to bring another one, bring one article to next week's session, because the lecture with Jumana, you will have to critically appraise that article. Okay. So now, Dina. But now, actually, we're going to have a break, and we have breakfast in the kitchen.
ירדנו לארלו, זה נטע ואני בקורונה התחלנו ללכת. נחלות מתחיל ליד הבית שלי, נחלות מתחיל ליד הבית.